Welcome to Unexpected Points. I am your host, Kevin Cole. I am joined this week by Rob Pizzola, professional sports bettor. I don't know. Are we friends? Are we acquaintances? We've met multiple times. So for most people on Twitter, that's like blood brothers, basically.
Yeah, I mean, we're at least acquaintances. I'll put it that way. But yeah, I think we met at Sloan probably 3 or 4 years ago, something around there, and run into each other every year. I like your Twitter stuff as well. You're a pretty good follow. So maybe we don't interact very often, but definitely familiar with a lot of your stuff, Kevin.
Yeah. I mean, and right back at you. And I think we'll talk a little bit today. You know, I want to always inspect people and as far as what their process is. And, you know, I got into a little bit of conversation with mutual acquaintance or mutual friend for you, maybe acquaintance for me, Jeff Ma, on Rufus and his podcast, Bet the Process. About his question posed to me was of the effect of, if you're not betting, then what value do you have to better? So we can talk about that a little bit more. I also want to talk about the slate for this week, and then we'll see if we can get into some peripheral stuff, maybe some election stuff, although I think we would probably, by the time this comes out, you know, I don't want to jinx anything that's happening there. But maybe I'll just jump straight into that first. So I know that you were very kind, and you sent something out on Twitter. I don't know how long ago it was. It may have been a year ago, saying that I was one of the people you were following, and you were becoming positive. You were turning over a leaf. I'm not sure how many times that leaf has flipped since then, but you're turning over this leaf to be positive, Rob. And you mentioned that you were following me on there. So as far as inspecting into your process, you're probably not as purely data driven and fixated on that sort of stuff as someone like Rufus is, who was on the podcast and described his philosophy. So what sort of nuggets are you able to pull out, not only for people like me who don't bet, but just throughout different informational sources to help you in your betting process?
Yeah, so I'm data driven first and foremost, but I don't find analytics to be the be all and end all. So a guy like Rufus, for example, will make a raw number on a game and he's just going to go out and bet it regardless.
Right.
Whereas I have more of a subjective opinion after the fact. And also what I like to do is compare to numbers that my current model is spitting out to maybe previous models as well, to see if there are big differences and then kind of investigate why. But there is a subjective level to what I do, at least over the course of the past couple of years. And I never used to be that way, but I used to find that when I add the eye test or things that just do not smell right to me with the output of a model into my process, I was getting better results in general. And I was tracking this stuff, like basically plays that I wasn't making as an output of my model, which I subjectively chose not to bet because I felt like there was something that I was missing. And what I particularly found was this was happening at the extremes a lot. So I could never get the best NFL teams to be as good as the market was making them, and the worst to be as bad as the market was making them. And then you go through an offseason of NFL, and I'm looking back at against the spread records for years, and the best teams in the league generally have a positive against the spread record, whereas the worst teams generally have a poor one. And I just made a subjective decision that I'm probably going to just stop betting on these bad teams regularly. And it worked out for me. So it starts with the data-driven analysis. I have a raw number for every game. It's an output of playing both teams head-to-head, so I don't actually do like power rate. I can tell you a team's power rating versus a league average team, for example, but I'm not just using ratings to generate my spreads on games. It's actually playing them head-to-head so that I can see how a strength of a team might play into a team's weakness or something like that. But once I get that raw number, I'm then taking the subjective approach to, okay, this makes sense to me. This makes sense to me. This might not. I'm going to investigate why that's happening. And I may or may not end up betting that.
Now, 2020 has been a little bit different. Not only COVID, opt-outs, I haven't tracked it exactly, but presumably there's been more injuries than usual, all that sort of stuff coming in. But even going back, you mentioned you've been looking at this more in prior years. Do you think anything has changed throughout the last few years? Or do you think if you would have implemented this updated process of quantifying and then adjusting, that would have been something that also would have been successful in the past. I guess there's anything about the NFL that makes it more successful now, especially when more and more people are betting based upon quantified models. So does that, can that whittle away the advantage that you would get off of doing that pure of a system?
Yeah, this one's always an interesting one. And there's better data available nowadays, for one, but everyone has access to that data, right? I don't think that there's data sets that exist in the NFL right now. At least I don't know of proprietary ones that exist that are going to blow away the public numbers that we're using. If there are, then that person probably has a pretty significant advantage in the NFL market. Data's changed. I've always felt that my strength, I'm not great at anything. I'm not a specialist. I mean, I didn't graduate university. I did take statistics and computer science in university. I would be a horrible programmer. As a statistician, I'm probably on a low level. I have very broad knowledge, but I'm very good at problem solving and applying logic to sports. And that's where I think my advantage is. So you give me a data set that you give someone else or give 100 people, and I would consider myself to be in like the 95th percentile of being able to apply that into some model and get outputs, proper outputs based off that. So that's where I think my advantage is. Most of that has come from just honestly Googling things for years and just learning as much as I can based off the problem that presented itself in front of me. But this year is, I mean, the NFL is changing. I'm not necessarily sure though, if I apply my process to 2 or 3 years ago, I think I would be just as fine, if not better. I think it's getting a little bit more competitive nowadays, but I think my current process, maybe it wouldn't have existed 3 years ago because we don't have the data, or I wouldn't have the data to use. But I just think, aside from the fact that teams are getting smarter, they're passing the ball a little bit more, like the game is evolving, I just don't really think that would affect my model or the outputs of the model much.
Yeah. I mean, on a data side, presumably somebody has some tracking data out there that, even if they're supposed to have it or not. But I don't know if they would get it like on an updated weekly basis or something like that, if there are any sort of leaks like that going on. But the ability to not only be able to use that data, then you're getting into a little bit of higher level of your ability for programming and being able to just process all of this data and then drive a meaningful insight and then have it be timely and impactful and then have it be something that's not reflected in the line. So yeah, I don't think, I guess this focus on data and always going to the next data source, it's probably like that bit of unique data that you can get. It's really going to be so marginal that the amount of time and effort that you would put into it really wouldn't be worth it anyway.
It could cause a lot of noise as well and headaches in general. Like I remember moving to StatCast data for Major League Baseball, which I thought was, this is available. Probably not a lot of people are using it right now, but it did create a lot of headaches for me. And I actually kind of fell out of love with baseball just because it became too much data to absorb for me, and the day-to-day grind just became way too much. So there are pros and cons, but obviously, the data sets will evolve. What we have now is not what it was 3 years ago, 5 years ago. And I've been lucky that I've been pretty consistent in winning at the NFL, but a lot of that has just been continuously adapting year to year and recognizing where the model has its limitations and just trying to figure out how do I go forwards here and make this as successful as possible? Because it is, the limits are high on NFL. It is a pretty tough market with tough competition. So you have to do whatever you can to keep ahead.
Now, okay, let's focus again on 2020. Has there been anything that's helped you be successful this year that, from a macro perspective, that you believe you either were quicker to recognize when others didn't recognize, or integrated into your process where, for instance, like the scoring thing that's going on. I could see someone who's a quant saying, well, it's only week one, we don't know. We have this trailing data. There's a lot of noise. And then week two saying, well, we're getting a little bit, and like by the time that it takes you too long to catch up or something like that. So, that's just an example of an idea, but is there that or anything else that you've seen this year?
Well, that's definitely one. Like, I wish I would bet on myself a little bit more than I do, to be completely honest with you, because that was something that I noticed right away. And I had a pretty strong feeling that the scoring was going to continue the way that it was when you looked at the reasons for scoring being up in general. But I didn't capitalize on that as much as I should have. I was just reluctant to pull the trigger on all these overs on a weekly basis. There's just something about betting the NFL for a decade and realizing, that the over more often than not is not the sharpest play. But I mean, that was one thing that I recognized. Home field advantage was another thing very early on for me that I was able to recognize that, I mean, we're not looking at anywhere close to the home field advantage. And this has been diminishing for years now. It's not just something that's abruptly started this year, but there's pretty much no home field advantage in the league right now. That could change as we start to see fans in attendance, and that could have some substantial impact, but I doubt it going forwards. So those are definitely the things that stand out to me right away. But unfortunately, if I'm being honest, I didn't capitalize on that. I still think totals are too low in the NFL. You look at last week, 4 or 5 games just impacted heavily by heavy winds and weather. We still saw scoring, which was higher than we would have seen in a standard week last season as well. So I still think totals are a tad low, but if I could go back, I would have pressed on that a lot more than I ended up doing.
Now, do you have, I mean, one of the things I've wondered about scoring is, so we have changes in no crowd noise or limited crowd noise or fake crowd noise in a lot of places. So there's that. There's the penalty angle, right? But also pre-snap penalties are down too. So that's probably a crowd noise sort of thing. There's an angle of perhaps, I don't know. I've been thinking about these things of like maybe players are executing better because they're like not going out and doing stuff. I don't know. They're just sitting around the house all day long. If they are, not enough clearly. If you see these COVID things that are coming out, so there's that angle to it. But I've also wondered about like just the quality of play and specifically the quality of play at quarterback. I feel like the floor is maybe a bit higher than it has been, or just the range, like the breadth of quality that you're seeing across the league at the quarterback position may be higher this year, and that might be part of it too.
So I agree with that, but I don't necessarily think it's just a product of quarterbacks being better. I think it's a product of offensive coordinators calling better games in general. So if you look at 1st and 10 runs, 2nd and long runs, you see them down quite a bit year over year. So coordinators are getting smarter about passing the ball on early downs, which is affecting quarterback play because it's putting them in better positions to succeed on 2nd and 3rd down and things of that nature. I think teams are being coached differently in general. One thing I particularly noticed this year, and this is something that like maybe a regular model doesn't pick up, but when you're watching as many NFL games as I do, especially the offensive pass interference, the pick plays, so to speak, you see a lot of receivers really selling the fact that they're running a route now, instead of just blatantly picking another player like you would have seen in years past. So that's going to affect your offense and your quarterback play because he's throwing to a lot more wide open receivers off of pick plays. So there's a number of things that contributed to it. It could just be general quarterback play, but overall, I think teams are using analytics more in their decision making, and it's creating more offense in the league. And we're seeing that. And there's a number of factors that are linked. Like crowd noise is probably linked to a lack of penalties in general on, false start penalties, things of that nature. And a lot of these things go hand in hand. And probably there's this happy medium between quarterback play improving and just the general play calling improving. But I don't think that it's just the quarterbacks alone have gotten better.
Right. Yeah, I guess that's a good point. Like you can't necessarily separate within the results, you can't necessarily separate this is a talent thing versus this is giving equally talented quarterbacks easier plays to execute. So I definitely agree. I mean, play actions up, motions up. You talk about the pick plays. It just seems anecdotally like every single 3rd and less than 5 or goal and less than 5 has some sort of pick in it. It's almost like a given at this point. So yeah, I think those are all really, really great points there. Do you think there's anything to... I mean, another thing I've thought about a little bit is this college to pro, like we talk about, the Andy Reids of the world and other people or that have kind of picked up started picking up a lot of what the college is doing. I'm wondering if maybe there's a tipping point there too. I mean, we see Joe Brady coming in. I mean, he's an example clearly of someone coming straight over from college to pro in Carolina. But I'm also wondering if this is like, if there's a step effect of the offense takes a step and the defense we're just like the offense is maybe 1 or 2 steps ahead of the defense now and what they've been able to integrate from these different concepts at this point.
Yeah, there's so many different hypotheses that I have. I mean, one of it, there was no training camp this year in the NFL either.
Right.
I don't know if that affects the offense or defense in the same manner. If it's an advantage to the offense, maybe it's not. Maybe scoring could be even higher if there was the training camps and the offense got to work together. So there's so many factors that we're in a year where things are just completely different. And there's a number of reasons that we could see all these things happening. The college to pro one is not something I ever considered, but there could be some validity to that as well. But I cannot give you the definitive reason why there's scoring is up the way it is. I know that there's a number of contributing factors, and I don't think there needs to be a definitive reason. I think you can make a lot of educated guesses and say, this seems to be the case. It's very likely to continue based off what I've seen. So like, I don't think teams are just going to revert to the play calling that we saw last year, with the exception of some teams like the Detroit Lions or, who love to run on first down and second down and things of that nature. They just haven't adapted to the new NFL. But you would assume that a lot of the trends that you're seeing right now are just things that will continue going forwards. And I think that's where a lot of people get into trouble. And this happened probably with the totals early on in the year, where if you're modeling, there's just this expectation that they're going to regress to the mean. And I don't necessarily think that's a reality in a lot of these cases. And the NFL is particularly difficult because you have such a small sample of games in general, relative to other leagues where they're playing on a daily basis. So yeah, it's very difficult to watch 3 weeks worth of games and say, this is going to continue going forwards. But at some times you have to just apply logic to what you're seeing and say, I think this is more likely to continue this way going forwards than to regress to what we've traditionally seen. And that's something for me that's important. And I think that's kind of where I gain an edge historically, especially early on in the year, whereas maybe a more traditional modeler is struggling in that sense.
Okay, well, I'll call it a related topic. I think there's some thematic similarities here that I've heard you talk about the fact that you don't have priors throughout the season. Everyone has an idea of how good a team or a quarterback in particular may be. And then you're not going to judge them. Just to be very simplistic, you're not going to judge them on week 2 just strictly based upon what happened in week 1, right? So you're going to have something bad. Now, I remember you saying, I don't remember what week it was. It was pretty early, though. It was maybe week 5 or something like that you did not really incorporate priors into your process anymore. I don't think it's the same thing as what we're talking about, but I think there are some similarities, which is a quicker update but this is in a strictly modeling capacity, updating more quickly based upon what you're seeing. Let's talk about that a little bit. So was I right about the date? Is this a newer thing that you've also transitioned to, or has this always been the case that you leave priors by the wayside fairly early in the season?
I transitioned to this when I started doing things at a player level. So I used to do things at a team level. And then a couple of years ago, I transitioned to a player level model. And it was just something that I felt was necessary. I did a lot of back testing on this, and I respect that priors can work in some scenarios. I just think in the NFL, especially, there's so many things that can go wrong when you're accounting for using priors, injuries in the previous year. There's just a number of things where I feel like we have a generally good sense of what teams are 6, 7, 8 weeks into the season. I really do. Whereas I'm not really looking to go back to last year and say, wow, this player, is significantly overachieving or underachieving versus last year, and I think he's going to get back to that level. I don't necessarily think that's the case. So I don't have zero priors built into the model right now, but it's very small. It's having a very minimal impact at this point in the season. So, I've had I've had some big disagreements with people on this before, but I'm going to mention Rufus here, not because Rufus is a very smart bettor in general, but like the whole notion of betting the Jets every week, which he jokes about now. And it's largely built off of his prior in the beginning of the year. and what he would rated the Jets going into the year. And it was very similar for me. I had a substantial play last week on Pittsburgh against Baltimore. I could never get to that number on Baltimore last week because they've not played like an elite team this year. And yes, I thought they were going to be an elite team going into the year, but you look at their EPA per play on offense through how many weeks had we played last week? 7, I think? I don't even know what week we're in anymore, but they were.
Yeah, it was week 8 last week. Yeah.
Yeah. League average offense. And people just think that they're going to go back all of a sudden to what they were a year ago when so much has changed. I mean, there's been an offseason. Defenses have had an entire offseason to study the Baltimore Ravens offense. Lamar Jackson missed a week of practices 1 week with what was reported as a knee injury. I have no idea if he's healthy, but there's something going on with the Ravens offense now. And to me, that line just didn't make sense. And for a lot of people, they love the Ravens in that spot because they're building in a prior from the beginning of the year where the Ravens were a significantly better team than the Steelers. That's one example of it working in my favor. I'm sure there's examples I can think of where it doesn't work in my favor, but I think we get to the midway point of the season and we have a pretty good understanding of what these teams are.
Yeah, it's fine. I was gonna talk about the Ravens specifically when we were discussing this week's slate because I feel like that probably is maybe not the one team, but one of the teams when we're talking about the quarterback specifically in your prior versus what you may see. Yeah, I know. I mean, the Saints have kind of had a little bit of a turnaround, but they would have been another team probably early in the year, although they had a lot of penalty issues on defense. So
that's the thing, I sorry to interrupt you, Kevin. That's the thing about the Saints too that people don't realize. So like, I like the Saints. I'm generally high on the Saints. I think going forward, it has nothing to do with their prior going into the year. It's more so that I think that they've been unlucky in the sense that you look at what their penalty margin has been this season. I guess you can say maybe they're just, Greg Williams has lost his mind and he's coaching up the defense to commit all these penalties. But I think you will see some regression to the mean there, and maybe not to the point where things are 50-50, but it's an insane yardage margin in terms of penalties, and that was largely built up this year. Plus, they've been missing arguably their best player on offense in Michael Thomas, and Emmanuel Sanders being out for them as well. They're still a 5-2 team, and I know they've played a lot of close games this year, but they've had a lot of things stacked up against them. So for me, I'm generally high on the Saints going forwards, but it has nothing to do with what I've seen from them in previous seasons. It's more so that they will be getting players back, and there's probably some positive regression in terms of penalties going forwards for them.
Yeah, and Drew Brees has not been that bad, compared to what some people think and what that offense has been. I mean, I think everyone is assigning that mostly to likely offensive player of the year, Alvin Kamara, but maybe Brees isn't quite as washed as people think. Well, let's get into the slate since we're discussing. We've already kind of talked about a couple of the teams we're probably going to discuss anyway here for week 9. So I reached out to you beforehand and asked you about some games that you wanted to talk about. Maybe I'll just leave it to you. I don't know if there's a particular matchup that you want to mention. I tried to pull some nuggets out on these games and see where we may differ in our opinions on them.
Yeah, so this is the second week in a row where the line in the Seahawks game doesn't make sense to me at all. So Seahawks at the Bills this week, we're seeing most of the market is at 2.5 right now, approaching 3. I like Seattle quite a bit again this week. I was heavily on Seattle last week. Didn't really love to see the market moving against me in that game, but ultimately very happy to get the win there. To me, Seattle is a team that is bordering on elite if they're not elite right now. I have Kansas City number 1 in the league, but I think there's an argument to be made for Seattle number 2 just by virtue of their offense being so good. And you look at the matchup against Buffalo, this Bills defense, again, if we were going to go back to last year, very good defense. This year has not performed for whatever reason. I can't tell you the exact reason that they haven't specifically, but this is a defense that's 23rd in EPA per play this season, which is actually worse than the Dallas Cowboys defense in EPA per play, if you want to put it into perspective. And not a lot of people would expect that. And in fact, going into this game, the Seahawks have a better EPA per play on defense than the Bills do this season. So Seattle goes in with a better defense this season, getting Jamal Adams back at safety, trading for Carlos Dunlap on the defensive line a week ago, activated Snacks Harrison on the defensive line a week ago, who didn't play last week, but is expected to play this week, which will impact their run defense even more. And I go into this matchup where you have this elite offense. I don't know how the Bills defense is going to stop Russell Wilson. I mean, potentially they put Tre'Davious White on one of the two receivers, like we saw San Fran do last week with Jason Verrett against Tyler Lockett. And then the other receiver is just going to feast because they have two elite receivers. So I don't know where the Bills get a bunch of stops unless the weather is really poor in Buffalo. It doesn't look like it's going to be the case. I live in Toronto. It's like, I don't actually have the Fahrenheit conversion in my head because we deal with Celsius, but it's hot today. Like it's going to be hot the rest of the week. So you're going to get good weather in Buffalo probably on Sunday. And I just don't see how the Bills offense keeps up. And if you look at the Bills season numbers on offense as a whole, you'll see 5th in EPA per play on offense. And you'll be like, well, this offense is humming along. But really, if we look at the last 4 weeks and we divide the season into two, first 4 weeks, the Bills were amazing. This powerhouse that couldn't be stopped. Last 4 weeks, all of a sudden, they can't move the ball, or at least they're moving the ball at a league average rate. And that comes against defenses that aren't particularly good. I mean, I think they've played one top 10 defense in the last 4 weeks, which is the Chiefs. And the Chiefs, some people would say, are probably not a top 10 defense. So, I don't know. I just don't get to this number. I would have made this much higher. So this is going to be the second week in a row where I really like the Seahawks.
Yeah, no, all of that makes sense. But I'm wondering about let's talk about the Buffalo offense for a little bit, because I do think there are some degrees of unsustainability. Josh Allen, as part of his play earlier in the season, third down conversions were extremely high for them. Where, I mean, there are some things where you could say it makes some sense. He can like fight off blitzes. He can scramble. He can keep plays alive, but he hasn't been able to do that as much. I guess maybe if we peek back a few weeks in the past, we talked about this not having a prior. I mean, the prior on Allen probably would have been pretty low going into the season, and he was really hot to start the season. So when you're viewing him, maybe if we can rewind and have a little bit of hindsight here. Now, is it a situation where you would have said, I'm going to ignore the prior more than other people and believe he's good? Or is it a situation where it's not like ignoring anything. It's like, I'm going to use my common sense as to who he is.
Yeah, I think it's very challenging. He's a case that's extremely challenging because I was not high on Josh Allen at all going into the year. But the numbers were good. Most importantly for me is he really passed the eye test as well. I do like to watch games and investigate games where I guess either a team or a player is significantly deviated from what I thought they were coming into the year. And in the case of Josh Allen, he significantly deviated. But to me, what I especially noticed in the first 3 or 4 weeks of the season was his accuracy was really good. He wasn't known as a quarterback that was accurate. In fact, there's all sorts of highlight reels you can watch on YouTube, which will make you laugh, from last season where he just completely missed deep balls by like 10, 15, 20 yards. But he wasn't so far this year. And then they came out and they played that game. I think it was against Kansas City, where I thought Brian Daboll, their offensive coordinator, who I think has done a really good job this year, game planned that game perfectly to start against Kansas City. And Allen just missed so many receivers, like guys running wide open. So it's challenging, but like I have Allen rated better than I did going into the year, but I would still have him as being roughly an average quarterback right now. And I don't have a strong degree of confidence either way. Based off recency, I'd lean towards him being closer to last year than what we saw in the first 4 weeks. But who knows? That game against Kansas City, there's wet weather. The game against the Jets, they moved the ball very easily, but bogged down in the red zone. I mean, they got 18 points. They were just horrible in the red zone. And that's actually been one of the biggest differences with this offense when you look at the first 4 weeks compared to now is the red zone success rates, especially touchdowns. I think they're at like 40% touchdowns in the red zone over the last 4 weeks, which is significantly lower than the 70% in the first 4 weeks of the season as well. So challenging cases, try to put a number to it like I always do. Does it pass the eye test for me? If it does, I'll roll with it. If not, there's some element of subjectivity that goes into it.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. Yeah, I do think it's this weird situation where you mentioned how the Bills haven't really faced any good defenses. At the same time, I guess we'll see after a couple of more weeks. But I do think there's some possibility, which I never would have imagined having said this, 2-3 weeks into the season. I do think there's some possibility that Josh Allen could be underrated in some way because of the fact that they haven't scored a lot of points. But he's played pretty well, other than the Kansas City game. And the Kansas City game, he didn't play well. Maybe you could blame it on the weather if you wanted to, or something like that. But I thought he was good in the Tennessee game until they got down. Like, he was good. He was good against New Jersey, but like you're saying, they couldn't score. And he was pretty good against New England. I'm looking at like a success rate versus production thing. Like, his success rates were extremely high in all of those games, but they just weren't leading to big plays. He was kind of like grinding the ball down the field. And I think that's what defense has been able to do to him, is they've said, you know what, we're just going to make you like convert these third downs over and over and over again. And that seems to have stymied them somewhat. So I'd be interested to see if it's a luck thing, it's a fluky thing, or whether the defenses have kind of figured out how to suppress him a little bit.
It might be a combo of both. Like I said, I think Dayball's done a good job this year. I've watched a lot of Bills. I think he's game planned really well. I think he calls a good game. I think Bills fans are kind of fed up now with the results of the past few weeks, and they're calling for more of a running game, which is hilarious to me because the passing game has actually largely been effective. And the only time that their runs are really effective is when Josh Allen is running, which are off of called passes most of the time. So I don't think they're going to switch that anytime soon. It's something to keep an eye on, but if they do start to run the ball a little bit more because Allen has been less accurate in the past few weeks, I think that's a recipe for disaster against Seattle. They shut down San Fran's run game last week. They've been a top 10 run defense all season long. And again, adding a couple strong defensive linemen, I think, is only going to help them going forwards as well. So it's interesting to see, but like whenever you get a player that plays on, like, I wouldn't even say he played on an extreme, like he played extremely well. And I don't think Allen has played bad really at any point this year, but you always tend to get these extremes with the way that people react nowadays. And more often than not, the player finds a level somewhere in the middle. And I think that's what we're going to see with Josh Allen. He's not as good as he was the first 4 weeks. The last 4 weeks, they've struggled in the red zone. There will probably be some improvement there. But to ask him to go toe-to-toe and score for score with Russell Wilson, which is you're asking this week, the game's not a pick 'em, but 2.5 points. I don't think he's capable right now.
Yeah, I think I agree with you there. All right, so let's another game that you had mentioned to me was the Ravens Colts. So what's your take on this one? Let me just give a little background here. So Ravens Colts, I see it now. It looks like it might be Baltimore minus 2.5. 47 is the total. Colts are the home team. But what are you thinking here?
Yeah, so it's unfortunate. I sent you this lean yesterday, Kevin, and since then we've seen the total that's gone from 45 up to 47 this morning, which I wholeheartedly agree with. And part of it is the atmosphere. Like, they're playing this game indoors, fast track. In the new NFL, I do not think you should see totals in the mid 40s in indoor games that are not affected by weather, plain and simple. And then, yes, I get both of these defenses are good. I get that the Ravens offense has been struggling. I get that T.Y. Hilton's banged up for the Colts, but all of that, put into my number, I'm still getting a total that honestly I think should be closer to 48.5, 49 points. So I quite like the over here. You add in the fact now that the Ravens are dealing with this COVID situation, for sure down a cornerback this week. Pretty much their entire linebacking core is not practicing this week because they've had contact with the corner, Marlon Humphrey, and I don't see why this total is where it was earlier in the week. So good to see that the market agrees with me. I also personally just like the Colts in this spot. I somehow trust their offense more now than I do with the Ravens, which seems weird going into the year. But you look at Baltimore, 21st EPA per play this year. If you're looking at DVOA, they're 20th offensively. They're still very high in their rushing EPA, but they're struggling in drop back. And particularly because of their receiving core, in my opinion. And that's one thing that stood out to me going into the year where, Marquise Brown and Willie Snead, Miles Boykin, Chris Moore, Devin Duvernay, like these are not – this is a low-end receiving core for a team that was expected to be elite. So ultimately, I don't really agree with the price on the game. I would have made this closer to a pick 'em, and I think you can get the Colts roughly plus 120 in most spots right now on the money line. I wouldn't say it's necessarily an overreaction to last week because I've kind of been down on the Ravens just in general overall, but I don't see much separation between these two teams right now.
So are you buying? I mean, the Colts defense I think was extremely strong to start the season. Has been pretty good since then. I don't think I think they seem to be a solid unit, but offensively, I'm not quite sure what to make. I mean, I was probably higher than most on Rivers coming into the year, but now because of some blow up performances in particular, he's been really good. While the running game has not been good at all. So are you buying Phillip Rivers, I guess, is what I'm looking at? Because he's a guy who's had some lower success rates, but then has been putting up pretty good EPA numbers, and they've been stringing out some longer plays, especially like dump offs and things like that have ended up being longer plays that I'm not sure if those are sustainable also.
Yeah, I think Frank Reich's done a great job in there, and in general, just putting Rivers in a position to succeed. I'm buying Rivers in the sense that I think he's capable of producing these performances, but I don't think he's capable of producing like three straight in the playoffs, especially
Right.
going against some better defenses. So maybe not the Colts as a contender, but in this spot, you know the Ravens are going to blitz a lot. That's just their bread and butter on defense. They blitz more than anyone in the league. Reich is not an idiot when it turns to in terms of game planning for opposing defenses. I think you'll see a lot of Rivers getting the ball out early, which he does fairly well, and a lot of yards after the catch for the Colts just in general. On the other side of things, and why I kind of gravitated towards the over as well, I think it's pretty obvious now that if you're game planning to go up against the Ravens, you're going to do what you can to stop the run and force Lamar to beat you down the field. And I think that's just going to gravitate to overs in the short term, as the Ravens are forced to throw the ball a little bit more. And maybe they're not going to be the most successful offense in throwing the ball downfield, but they're not going to be dead last in the league either. They're going to hit some plays here and there, and they have an ability to put up some big plays. So, yeah, I see this being indoor, fast track, 27-24 type of game that in the Colts' favor. So I do have I mean, they're not huge, strong leans at this point, and I think the market has come in on Indy and the over here. But I still do like them at the current prices.
Yeah, yeah. And then, Rivers, he might be good for like a pick six or something. So that's good for the over too,
Well, that's the thing. Like turnovers now too. Like Lamar Jackson was baited.
Yeah, he's turning it over a
Week,
lot. Yeah.
bad throws, and when the running game is not working for him, he's gonna scramble out, and that brings turnovers and into play, which creates some short fields like we saw against Pittsburgh last week, or pick six like we saw against Pittsburgh last week. And both these defenses in general are pretty good at capitalizing on mistakes.
All right. So the last game that you mentioned to me was is the Saints Bucks. That's going to be one of the biggest matchups of the week. As of now in Tampa, they're 5-point favorite. I'm seeing 51.5 on this. Well, what are your? It looks like it's gone down from 54.5 to 51.5. But then I don't know where that opening line, how solid that opening line was. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I like the Saints. I mean, I would certainly be looking for a 6. I don't think you're losing much value in at 5.5, 5, waiting for a 6. It probably won't happen. I suspect that the market's going to like the Saints as well, as we've seen so far. But I never I take look ahead lines with a grain of salt, because they're just a look ahead line. There's very small limits, but in most spots, the Bucks were 4.5 look ahead line against the Saints. I thought the Bucks, I mean, they came down to the wire against the Giants on Monday Night Football. They didn't play a really great game, and all of a sudden the market is corrected, and the numbers shot up a little bit, or at least you're getting a little more value on the Saints. I just don't see that much of a discrepancy between these two teams, especially when you consider the lack of home field advantage in football this year. There might not be a home field advantage, or are we willing to say right now that the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are 5 points better than the New Orleans Saints on pretty much a neutral field? I don't think anyone can say that with any sort of confidence whatsoever. I think the Saints were a little bit lucky in week 1 against the Bucks earlier this year. I do get that. But their offense is better than people realize. A lot of people jump on Drew Brees because he's not throwing the ball downfield a little bit. He's not throwing the ball downfield a lot. I mean, his air yards is, I think, still the lowest in the league. I'd have to double check that, but just in general, it's more of a dink and dunk offense. But that doesn't change the fact that it's been a fairly efficient offense. They went up against a very good Bears defense last week, who's top 10 in pretty much every metric that has value in terms of NFL defenses. So the offense might be coming in riding a low, so to speak, with the potential of getting receivers back this week. It looks like Michael Thomas is possible to play. Emmanuel Sanders possible as well. So all those things work in their favor. I just don't see that much separating these two teams. And this is coming from someone who thinks the Bucs are very good. Like I think Tampa deserves to be in that discussion of top NFC team, if not the top NFC team right now. But I cannot get to this distinction between these two teams.
Now, I know for not okay, it went down a bit week over week, but I know for DVOA, which is going to weight offense and defense roughly by whatever their contribution is. Like, you're not going to give extra weight to offense as most people would do. But they had the Bucs going into last week as being a step above most teams. I think they're still number one. I'm not sure. I'd have to check if they are or not. So that's another question. So you're not viewing them as like the best team in the league in that sort of manner. And where would be the difference?
So for me, Kansas City is the best team in the league, and it's not not remotely close. I would honestly make.
I would agree with you.
Kansas City probably a field goal favorite against anyone right now on a neutral.
Yeah, I think that's around where we have it. Yeah, exactly 3 points. Yeah.
Right. So I don't.
We're higher on Baltimore though, probably than you are. But yeah.
Like so we got Kansas City, and then we got this tier of teams, which I think is probably 6 teams right now, who I think I have rated maybe within a point of one another. 4 of those teams are in the NFC. So you have Tampa, Seattle, Green Bay, New Orleans, and then you have Pittsburgh, Baltimore in the AFC. I don't have my ratings up right in front of me right now, but they're very close together.
Right.
Depending on the week and how the performance is, those can change, and we'll see those change a lot over the course of the year. So I'm buying the Bucs. Like I especially. I do weight offenses more than defenses generally in the NFL, but it's not like the Bucs have a bad offense. Like they don't have an elite offense; they have a very good offense. It's not like they're being downgraded a ton for their offense, and that's again largely without having Godwin and Evans together on the field at the same time for the majority of the year, which. I mean, obviously that's going to be a big factor for them as well. So, I mean, for me, Chiefs number one, but I'm a believer in the Bucs. I just don't even know what's going to happen in the NFC between those 4 teams, and I hope it gets to a point where those 4 teams are playing each other to decide who gets to the Super Bowl, because I think we're going to see some really good games if that's the case.
Yeah, that would be fantastic. I guess with Michael Thomas. And the questions of the position players coming back for the Saints, how do you incorporate that in? Because I think that's one of the more difficult things to do, especially when you have multiple players, because there could be like some sort of synergy effect or something like that. But anyway, so how do you look at that?
So what I do now, and this is the biggest change for me, is I put an arbitrary percentage on what I think Michael Thomas's chances of playing are, and he's going to be included in that many simulations. So if I think Michael Thomas is a true coin flip, 50-50, I'll set him at 50% for the game, and I'll create my number based off of that. And then I'd do the same. Like if they had cluster injuries at a position, so Thomas and Sanders, I'd set them both to 50-50, and it's going to be kind of random into what simulations that they end up in and which simulations that they don't. But that's how I incorporate it. I personally think it's the best way to do it in general, but I could also easily just make a number on like a worst case scenario number, which I have for this type of game as well. So if Michael Thomas and Emmanuel Sanders are both out for New Orleans, I would still play them. So that's kind of a bit into my process. My raw number, the first one that I'm going to produce, is based on what I actually think is the most likely scenario in terms of their realistic probability to play. And I do this for all teams, and it's the most labor intensive, time intensive thing that I do on a weekly basis. But I like it. And I like having some sort of control over what I'm doing and adding some element of subjectivity into it, where I think I'm actually a decent predictor at who's going to play and who's not going to, just based off of research, sadly, like oddly enough. But I invest, like, that's a difference. Honestly, I invest time into the NFL. I really do. And I think it's what's needed for me to have the success that I've had, or else I wouldn't do it. But whereas somebody might just run a number and bet their numbers, and that's fine. And they might turn a positive ROI, but maybe they're leaving money on the table doing that. So that's just kind of been my MO, I guess.
Any idea if you were to rank order positions, where wide receiver falls as far as the importance of taking these guys in and out, especially in an elite player like Michael Thomas? Because I think there is, in some analytical circles, there's a building idea that wide receivers could be the second most valuable position. They're not played as such. Edge defenders are paid like the second most valuable position, and especially this last offseason, what we saw with Bosa and with Myles Garrett, it's really kind of expanded quite a bit there. But maybe how much they're being paid might also be a reflection of the depth of the position. So it can be valuable but deep at wide receiver. So how do you think about wide receiver?
So I can't give you an exact answer, but I'd say that there's probably a 90% chance that I would have wide receivers being the second most valuable position.
Okay. Yeah.
I think it's very, very likely. On average, against the league average team, Michael Thomas being out of the lineup for the Saints, I'd probably have that worth more than a point right now against the league.
Wow. Okay.
At least elite receivers are probably in and around that range. Odell Beckham was out for Cleveland last week. I ran the sims with him being in and him being out. And I know Higgins has performed well this year specifically, but I still had that close to being a 1 point difference for the Cleveland Browns last week. Probably why I ended up with an edge on the Raiders in general. So
I heard their offense is better without him, though. That's what
narratives make me. They make me laugh, like they really do. But no, I agree with that, and I think you nailed it in terms of why the elite pass rushers or get paid more, and it's just because of the position scarcity in general. Whereas there's a larger pool of elite receivers than elite pass rushers, and there's a more of a drop off, I guess, from top to bottom. But I certainly would say that my model values receivers.
Right. Okay, well, let's get back. Enough time talking about position players. I want to ask some questions about quarterbacks, and specifically, when we have these backup quarterbacks, we have a situation where backup quarterbacks are playing. So we had the Ben DiNucci experience last week. It sounds like he's out, and now we have potentially Cooper Rush he's not out, but they're not. I heard today that I saw somewhere that Cooper Rush or Garrett Gilbert of AAF fame may be starting there. You have in Jacksonville, Luton, I want to say is his name, from Washington State, a 6th round rookie who may be playing there. Typically, I don't. Maybe we can ask specifically about these situations. I mean, we have Dallas as a 14-point underdog at Pittsburgh, and then the Jaguars are a 7-point underdog. I'm not sorry, Dallas at home, a 14-point underdog, and then the Jaguars are a 7-point underdog at home against the Texans. So maybe if you have thoughts specifically about those, but just generally when we have these, you're adding this huge degree of uncertainty to a game. Do you have an overarching philosophy on staying away, or thinking, well, this provides opportunity in a sport which has fewer edges? This may be something where you can actually derive an edge.
Potentially. So I think the latter is true if you're really keeping your pulse on the college scene in general, which I can't say is true of me. I don't watch a ton of college football in general. There are probably people that have watched Luton play maybe a dozen games of college football that can give you a pretty accurate assessment of what they think of him as a quarterback, or Ben DiNucci or whatever. It doesn't matter what the example is. So that's not something that I'm privy to or confident in making an assessment of a college football player. I don't have a really good way of accounting for this. I do look at historicals. So quarterbacks that are drafted in similar positions, I remove outliers like Tom Brady, for example, who was a late round draft pick that turned out to be the best quarterback of all time. And then I kind of apply that to the model, but I get some funky numbers doing that sometimes. So I don't really trust that process. Another thing that I've really started to do over the last couple of years, and what I especially find valuable, is just to run the game with the quarterback that was expected to, the quarterback that got injured. So for example, what I've done with Jacksonville and Houston this week is ran the game as if Gardner Minshew is starting. And what would my number be on that game? Which I got Houston by a median of, I think, close to 6.5. So I ended up betting Houston minus 6.5 earlier this week because there is an element of uncertainty with Luton, but is he going to come in and be Gardner Minshew right away? And I'm not saying Gardner Minshew is good. He's a below average quarterback. I think I have him ranked somewhere in the 25th out of 35 qualifying quarterbacks this year, somewhere around there. But the likelihood of Luton being worse than Minshew for me is high. So I'm comfortable in, I think, at the worst case scenario, I'm coin flipping. I think like worst case scenario, Luton comes in and he's maybe tops out at what Gardner Minshew is. So that's kind of my process there. I do tend to avoid those games in general. I had an edge on Miami last week. I didn't end up playing it. In hindsight, I probably should have, but yeah.
Well, that was a little bit of a weird game, but yeah.
It was a weird game. I think people might be down on Miami going forwards because of it, saying like, oh, like, look at these yardage totals. And we didn't really see anything out of the Miami offense, but they were never really in a position where the offense had to show you anything last week. Like they were playing from such a positive game state for the entire game that I'm probably higher on market than Miami, higher than market on Miami right now than others. But yeah, that just in general, that's kind of, I have no exact science in valuing these backup quarterbacks. I try to just apply logic to the problem and say, this makes logical sense to me, so I'm going to go with it. But it's pretty rare that I'm involved on games with these backups.
Yeah, and this, I mean, I'm just somewhat intrigued by this by this Pittsburgh Dallas game, just because 14 points. I mean, I know the road thing doesn't really matter that much. I'll give you that, but the Pittsburgh offense, I mean, you know, it could get a lot better against the Dallas defense than it has looked, but it's not the Chiefs. I guess this is kind of like approaching Jets-Chiefs territory when you think about the flipping of the home field and, you know, and things like that. But I wouldn't put Pittsburgh nearly as close. Is there anything that you can look at and say, well, it's, you know, this is just high that you could, is there any way you could ever get to a number you're saying I could kind of assume that this would be a profitable bet just because it's so dramatic?
Yes, but I've gone down that path in the past, right? Like the year the Browns lost every game, and I don't know, they covered like 4 of those games. I was consistently value in the Browns. I'm like, I got to stop doing this to myself. And I'm just kind of there with bad teams in general. I don't have a sticky note here, but I like to write myself notes that I kind of see around. My office is kind of like Russell Crowe in A Beautiful Mind, where, you know, you get into that his shack or whatever, and he's got all the clippings on the wall. But that's like me. Here's my, you know, trust the process one that I have over here, and one of them that's around is don't bet on bad teams. And it's kind of something that I stick by because, like, it's just been like when you have this sample of hundreds bordering on thousands of games of NFL bets over the years, and then you just find this negative ROI that stands out like immediately when you start to filter, and it's these bad teams, and like, why am I doing this to myself? And I keep feeling like, yeah, there might be value here, but there's probably not. Like, what is Dallas's path to success on offense against the Pittsburgh defense? I don't know how. I'm not sure how they scored. Like I'm not even exaggerating. Maybe there's some sort of element of surprise with the Cowboys offense, but the offensive line, they're down their left tackle, their center, their right tackle. It's not like they're going up against the best defensive front in the entire league. I don't know what they can run offensively unless the Steelers have completely mailed in this game. Like they've been sipping champagne bottles all week because they beat the Ravens, and like, I just don't know where the path to success is there. So I've kind of just gone down the path of, again, I'll reiterate it over and over. Just I would very much just strictly play the numbers in the past, where now I can't make a logical argument for Dallas. I don't know. I don't know what number you'd have to give me to bet Dallas this week. There's a price that everyone should have to bet any side of either game. I probably have one with Dallas, but I'll tell you 14 isn't it.
Okay. Well, so another game that's interesting from a modeling perspective is this Thursday night game, if only because you talked about running these scenarios with players in or out of the game. I mean, we can just go through here. No Jimmy Garoppolo, no George Kittle, no Aaron Jones, probably no Jamal Williams, no Al Lazard, no, I believe still Deebo Samuel, Tevin Coleman. Is there anyone else I'm missing? AJ Dillon.
Contracted COVID apparently today.
Yeah. Oh, right. Yeah. Kendrick Bourne is now out. So they cut Dante Pettis. Not that he mattered, but they really don't have anyone. So like in this scenario, do things just start to break down if you're like assuming so many players who are being elevated into a role that they would never touch unless it was in this type of circumstance?
Well, there's a lot of very difficult things to account for and model for. That's probably one of the toughest is the cluster injury situations at a specific position. I've already had to deal with that with San Fran once this year when pretty much their entire secondary was out at one point. I think they had 4 of their top 5 cornerbacks and both starting safeties out a couple weeks ago, and they actually still ended up winning that game, which was against the Rams, I believe. But it's challenging. Again, I would say I have very little confidence in that process. I try to do what I think is right and apply logic to the problem. But this week is definitely a shit show for that game in particular. I'm holding a Green Bay -2 ticket, which I collected. So I was heavily invested with Seattle and San Fran on Sunday, watching the game. Saw Jimmy G go to the locker room, saw George Kittle leave the game, quickly checked everywhere I could to see if there was a look ahead. There was a couple PPHs posting it, prominent offshore with $1,000 limits would allow you to keep betting after every minute. So I actually got down a decent amount of money on Green Bay -2. But I actually think that and this is something I pointed out with Seattle last week as well. I think the running back injuries, the cluster running back injuries for the Green Bay Packers work to their advantage, because it might force them into a more pass-heavy offensive game plan. And I think we saw that with Seattle last week. They have a tendency to pass more, especially early on in the first quarter, but they really realized they could do whatever they wanted in the passing game, and there was no point handing the ball off to a 4th-string running back. And I think that worked to their benefit. I think you'll probably see the same for Green Bay this week. Heavy passing offense against a pretty depleted defense. I think probably anything short of 7 is a short price for the Packers this week.
Yeah, I think that's kind of like the logical place you can get to. Although, like you mentioned, it's a little bit of a mess over there. I'm looking through. I don't know if I see anything that I find that interesting. Although I did think this Washington football team Giants game was at least a little bit interesting for the fact that I'm seeing Washington as a 3-point favorite there. You have any opinion on the Giants? Because Daniel Jones, like, turnover machine, right? And it's been pretty consistent, but I don't know. Some part of me is just thinks that, well, if he's not a turnover machine, they might be good, because he actually hasn't been that bad, at least how we've graded him. The points just haven't been there as you would have hoped they would have been there based upon how well he's played. Anyway, I guess I have this feeling that I kind of think like the Giants, at least offensively, maybe are not as bad as they've played, but no real confidence in that take, I guess.
Well, I don't think their offensive coordinator is necessarily putting Daniel Jones in the best place to succeed, and that's a challenge for. I'm not high on Daniel Jones. Like, I don't think Jones is one of those guys that's going to go to another team or a change of setting that's going to all of a sudden, he's going to turn into the quarterback that they expected him to be when he's drafted first round. Like Sam Darnold might be that guy as an example with the Jets. I'm not convinced he is either, but. I look at this game in particularly. I have reluctantly bet on the Giants this week. I know I told you about I don't bet on bad teams unless they're playing another bad team.
Right.
What is separating Washington and the Giants right now? Like, you can make a case that one is marginally better than the other. I admittedly don't love the matchup of the Washington defensive line against the Giants offensive line. I think that's a mismatch, but that's factored into my simulation anyways. So it's not like I can't say I haven't accounted for that. I don't know. To me, this is like a game that should be maybe a 1-point spread. And I've reluctantly bet on the Giants. I might regret it, but yeah.
Yeah, I could see that. It's kind of weird. You're just like, well, I just hope there's no, like, he doesn't fumble basically in the pocket, and then you're okay. You're almost like rooting for what should be a freaky event not to happen, but he's like so consistently does that it makes it difficult to root against it.
But, the Washington offense is just as likely to turn the ball over. I mean,
that's true. Kyle Allen's done that, a lot of fumbling in his life. Yeah.
So, I mean, aside from Washington having the extra prep and the Giants having played Monday Night Football, which is not even as big a factor as people believe it is, there's not much separating those two teams at all. That's let's hope the Giants don't go down in flames, but it's definitely not a game that I'm going to be interested in watching on Sunday. I'll tell you that.
Yeah. Let's hope. Luckily, that's an early game, so we can drown it out with some of the other stuff there. Well, Rob, I appreciate you taking the time today, going through the slate. Everyone should be following Rob on Twitter at Rob Pizzola. You do some. Is the Periscope's a regular thing, or is that like a ad hoc sort of thing that you're doing?
So I do a Periscope every Sunday morning, 11 a.m., raising money for diabetes research. So I'm type 1 diabetic myself. It's a cause that's important to me. I don't get paid to do the Periscopes, but people love them and they seem to find value in them. I was going to stop them before last year, and I tweeted something publicly about not doing them. And I got so many messages that I said, okay, I'll do it, but I'll try to raise money for a good cause here. So if anyone enjoys the content that I do, whether it's on the Periscopes or anything else, really, I do have donation links pinned to my Twitter profile. And if anyone finds value in the content, then just donate what you can, because it's going to a good cause.
Yeah, no, I mean, I definitely do. I'll be checking that out. And of course, anyone enjoy what they heard here today, go check out Rob and do all that. Otherwise, that wraps it up for this week. And I appreciate everyone listening. Rate, review the pod. And otherwise, I'll be talking with you next week. Thanks.
You want to get rid of me and get back to more great PFF YouTube content? All you have to do is push that button right there and subscribe. Thanks for watching.